Hello everyone. Today we will start with the new chapter, that is chapter 4, Tribals, Dikus and the Vision of a Golden Age. When we think of India's freedom struggle, we often imagine great political leaders or urban movements. But long before the Indian National Congress was even born, people living deep in forest, hills and plateaus had already begun their own fight for freedom and dignity. These were India's tribal communities, which is Adivasis, whose lives were closely tied to forest, land, and nature. This chapter, Tribals, Dikus, and the Vision of a Golden Age, takes us into their world, a world that functioned on cooperation, simplicity, and respect for nature. We learn how the arrival of British officials, traders, moneylenders, and missionaries, whom the tribals called Dikus, meaning outsiders, changed everything. Their land was taken, their forest declared state property, and their traditional rights were erased under colonial laws. Now, out of this exploitation rose tremendous courage and resistance. From the Santhal Rebellion, which was in 1855 to between 1856, to the Ulgulan movement led by Birsa Munda, which was in 1894 and 1900. Tribals across India raised the banner of revolt. For Birsa and many others, freedom was not just about the fighting the British, it was about restoring a lost golden age where their land, forest, and the community life were sacred and self governed. Now, this chapter helps us understand how tribals lived before British rule, what changes came with the colonial administration, how they fought back through revolts, faith, and reform. By exploring their stories, we connect the local experience of tribal India to the larger freedom struggle and also recognize how issues like forest right and land displacement still echo in modern India, which is an essential knowledge for both school students and civil service aspirants. Now let's look at the one important person which is mentioned here, Birsa Munda. Now let's look at Birsa Munda's early life and its significance. Now Birsa Munda was born on 15th November 1875 in the Khunti district of present-day Jharkhand as part of the Munda tribe, one of the India's most prominent Adivasi tribal community. His birth anniversary is celebrated across India today as Janjati Gaurav Divas, which is Tribal Pride Day, and also marks Jharkhand Foundation Day, highlighting his status as a symbol of tribal identity and pride. Growing up, Birsa witnessed firsthand the severe disruption caused by British colonial exploitation. The arrival of outsider, meaning Dikus, meant loss of traditional Munda land, unfair taxes, forced labor, and increasing cultural pressure. These hardships profoundly shaped young Birsa's outlook on justice and rights. Birsa briefly attended a Christian missionary school in Chaibasa. Soon became aware of the school's real purpose. Unwilling to abandon his roots, Birsa left the school, motivated by the need to protect tribal tradition and resist outside domination. He began preaching a new faith called Birsaith. This movement was inspired by native customs and called for a return to honesty, unity, and spiritual purity, while directly challenging the authority of landlords and the British. Birsa's vision and courage gave hope to thousands, cementing his lasting significance as a legendary leader who inspired one of the most important tribal uprisings in colonial India. Understanding Birsa Munda's childhood and the rise of his leadership makes much more sense when we look at the world he was born into. Birsa's early years were spent in a tribal society that depended on the forest, respected communal customs, and valued freedom. Like most members of the Munda tribe, his family practiced the traditional way of living that had kept their community self sufficient and united for centuries. Now, Birsa's upbringing was deeply rooted in the daily rhythm of his village, working on land collectively owned by his clan, meaning the Khunkatti system, learning the art of shifting cultivation, and taking part in community gathering under the shades of tree and on the edge of the forest that provided their food, medicine, and sacred space. The entire tribe, including children like Birsa, felt a strong sense of identity and belonging to their land. So, before we discuss how British rule and the influence of outsider disrupted this world, Let's clearly understand what those traditional tribal lifestyle look like, because this is the word that Birsa and his people fought so hard to protect. Before British rule, tribal communities across India lived in harmony with the nature and followed varied lifestyle depending on their environment, meaning forest, hills, and plains. Their livelihood were rooted in self-reliance, community sharing, and the respect for the land. Each tribal group developed unique practices suited to local resources. Now let's see what practices they did. First is Zoom shifting cultivation. Tribals in hilly regions practice this traditional farming method. They cleared a portion of the forest, burned the trees to fertilize the soil, grew crops for a few years, and then shifted to another patch when the soil fertility was lost. It was sustainable and ensured forest regeneration. Now the next is hunting and gathering. Many tribes depended on forest for fruits, nuts, honey, medicinal herbs, and hunting animals. They exchanged surplus forest produce in weekly village markets or bartered with nearby farmers. They extracted cooking oil from sal and mahua. When forest resources became scarce, some had to seek work as laborer, though many of them, like Baigas, resisted this out of pride and tradition. Now, the next is herding and pastoralism. Some tribes, such as Van Gujars, which was mainly located in Punjab Hills, Labadis, Gaddis, and Bakarwals, moved seasonally with their herds of cattle, goats, and sheep in search of grassland and water. Their life revolved around migration and the rhythm of the season. Now, some of the tribes where they are located is mentioned here. Learn it because they are very important for exam purpose. Now the next is Khund Katti system, which is community land ownership. Among the Munda tribes, land was communally owned by a clan called Khund. Every member had right to use it collectively. This system promoted equality and strong community ties. No one was landless or exploited. Now the next is settled plough farming. Over time, some tribes began to cultivate the same land permanently using ploughs, leading to small village economies and trade ties with outsiders. British officials saw settled tribal groups like the Gond and Santhals as more civilized than hunter-gatherer or shifting cultivators. Those who lived in the forest and practiced shifting cultivation or hunting were considered wild or savage by the British. In all these ways of life, land and forest were not mere resources, they were sacred. Every tree, stream, and hill carried spiritual meaning and collective memory for the tribe. Now let's see who were the Dikus and their impact. The Dikus were outsiders who came into tribal areas and disrupted their traditional way of life. These included moneylenders, traders, British officials, and Christian missionaries. The example of silk growers exemplifies this exploitation. Tribes like Santhal, who reared silk, received meager prices for their cocoons, while middlemen and markets reaped huge profit. This added to the sense of economic injustice and resentment, making the market itself a symbol of exploitation. Now, such practices increased poverty, created dependence, and fostered hostility to colonial traders, linking to the broader resistance movement led by leaders like Birsa Munda, who fought to restore tribal rights and dignity. Now, Dikus exploited the tribal people in many ways by giving high interest loans, tricking them into signing land deeds that transferred their ancestral lands, and imposing oppressive taxes that the tribals had never faced before. The British introduced systems like zamindari and revenue collection that replaced the communal ownership of land with private ownership, turning many tribals into landless laborers. This led to hardships faced by forced labor, called as Veth Begari, and the gradual loss of control over their land and forest, which were central to their culture and survival. Simultaneously, British rule weakened tribal chiefs by stripping them of their traditional administrative and judicial power, forcing them to act as colonial agents. This led to a loss of respect for chiefs, disruption of tribal governance, and widespread confusion and alienation. These economics and political upheavals fueled tribal resistance and uprising like those led by Birsa Munda. Now let's see what happened to the shifting cultivators. Now British policies aimed to shift tribal cultivator from traditional jhum cultivation to settled agriculture, but this transition often failed, especially in regions with poor soil or water scarcity. The colonial system introduced land measurement and property rights, disrupting existing tribal farming practices. Many tribes faced poor yields and hardship, leading to protest. As a result, some areas continued to permit shifting cultivation, but in most regions it was restricted or banned. Consequently, many tribes were forced into landlessness and became tenants or migrated in search of work, often ending up as laborers in colonial enterprises like tea plantation and coal mines, facing exploitation and social displacement. Forest laws changed the tribal life. We discuss how the British disrupted tribal farming by trying to end jhum cultivation, forcing tribal to settle and farm permanently, which failed in many cases and led to landlessness and poverty. Closely linked to this was the British control over forests. The British government declared forest as state property through laws like Indian Forest Act of 1865 and 1878. These laws severely restricted tribal communities' traditional right to use forest for cultivation, hunting, and gathering. As a result, many tribes lost access to their essential resources. This loss of access led to displacement and increased poverty among tribals, forcing many to seek work as cheap labor in colonial enterprises such as plantation and mines. But the tribal did not accept this quietly. There were many uprisings and movement of forest satyagraha, meaning peaceful protests against these unfair laws, showing their determination to protect their forest and way of life. Now the hard Now, the hardship faced by tribal loss of land to Dikus, restriction imposed by British forest laws, and the erosion of traditional authority built up a powerful undercurrent of anger, and resistance. This environment paved the way for a historical tribal uprising led by Birsa Munda, which began in 1894. It is also known as Ulgulan movement. Birsa's movement aimed to drive out the Dikus and restore tribal rights over land and forest. His followers rallied under the vision of white flag symbolizing the creation of the Munda Raj, meaning Birsa Raj, a vision of the tribal self-rule free from colonial exploitation. The movement was militant and symbolic. Birsa's supporters attacked police stations, churches, and landlords, targeting the centers of colonial power and outsider influence. The revolt united many tribal groups across region, giving tribal communities a voice and hope after decades of dispossession. The British authorities arrested Birsa multiple times, and he died in jail in 1900 at the young age of 25. However, his revolt left a lasting legacy. It pressured the British government to enact protective legislation like the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908, which safeguarded tribal land rights. Now let's look at the some major tribal rebellion to struggle against the colonial exploitation. Birsa Munda's Ulgulan movement was one among several significant tribal uprisings throughout British India, each emerging as a reaction to specific colonial policies and exploitation by the Dikus. These rebellions collectively highlight the persistent spirit of resistance among tribal communities against loss of their land, forest, and traditional rights. The first is Pahadia Rebellion, which was between 1774 to 79, was one of the earliest organized tribal resistance against British encroachment onto tribal land. Now the next is Coal Rebellion between 1831 to 1832. It arose due to the land alienation when outsiders encroached on tribal territories, echoing the dispossession seen in Birsa's time. The Santhal Rebellion, which was between 1855 to 56, triggered by exploitation from the Dikus, is remembered as one of the largest tribal uprisings, directly protesting unfair taxes and land seizures. Now the next is the Bastar Rebellion. It was in 1910. It was a later movement opposing the British forest laws that had restricted tribal access to forest, a direct continuation of the fight initiated by earlier movement and echoed in the forest protests during Birsa's era. This is the Worli Revolt. It marked ongoing unrest against oppressive landlord and colonial policies, showing that tribal resistance was continuous and evolving well into the 20th century. Understanding these rebellion offer a broad picture of how tribal communities responded over time to British colonial control and exploitation through both armed uprising and organized protests. Birsa Munda's movement fits within this long history of resistance that shaped India's freedom struggle and prompted important reforms like Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act. Now let's see how this chapter connects to the UPPCS syllabus. This chapter aligns with the UPPCS syllabus of GS1 section on history, tribal issues, colonial impact, and the socio-political resistance of marginalized communities, providing important context and case studies for the exam. So we learned about the lives of India's tribal communities before or during British rule. Tribal lived in close harmony with forest, practicing shifting cultivation, hunting, and communal land ownership under the system like Khunt. The arrival of outsiders called Dikus, including British officials, traders, and moneylenders, brought exploitation through unfair loans, land grabs, and oppressive taxes. British forest law restricted tribal access to forest, increasing poverty and forcing many into labor. In response, tribal leaders like Birsa Munda led powerful revolts like the Ulgulan, inspiring unity and demanding restoration of tribal rights. His movement and other uprisings pushed the British to introduce laws protecting tribal lands, though struggle continued. Remember, this chapter shows us the courage of tribal communities in defending their culture, land, and dignity against colonial exploitation. It also helps us understand ongoing challenges faced by Adivasis in contemporary India. Now let's start with the exercise. First is let's recall, fill in the blanks. First is the British describe the tribal people as primitive or uncivilized. Next is the method of sowing seeds in jhum cultivation is known as shifting cultivation. Now tribal chiefs got zamindari title in central India under the British land settlement. Next is tribals went to work in the tea gardens of Assam and the coal mines in Bihar. Now the next is state whether true or false. First is jhum cultivators plow the land and sow seeds. Now it is a false statement as jhum cultivation involves shifting cultivation without plowing. Seeds are sown after clearing the patch. Next is cocoons were brought from the Santhals and sold by the traders at 5 times the purchase price. Now it is a true statement as traders exploited Santhals by buying cocoons cheaply and selling at much higher prices. Next is Birsa urged his followers to purify themselves, give up drinking liquor, and stop believing in witchcraft and sorcery. Now it is a true statement as Birsa promoted reform, advocating against liquor, witchcraft, and sorcery in his movement. Next is the British wanted to preserve the tribal way of life. It is a false statement as British policies disrupted tribal life aimed at extraction and control, not preservation. Now the next question is what problems did shifting cultivators face under British rule? Now under British rule, shifting cultivators faced major disruption due to colonial land policies. The British prioritized settled agriculture and introduced land measurement system, which undermined the traditional jhum cultivation. Many cultivators faced poor yields when forced to settle in unsuitable areas. The practice of shifting cultivation was banned or restricted in many regions, leading to landlessness, migration, and exploitation of tribals as cheap labor in plantation and mines. The question is how did the powers of tribal chief change under the colonial rule? Now before British rule, tribal chief held complete control over their territories, managing land, justice, and resources, and acting as community protector. Under British rule, their autonomy was curtailed. They could no longer make independent decisions. Chiefs were made agents of colonial administration, responsible for tax collection and law enforcement. The British reduced them to salaried officials, stripping them of their traditional authority. Now, what was the impact of this? They lost respect among their people, erosion of traditional governance system. Now, the tribal discontent and resistance, again, colonial interference increased. Now, the next question is what accounts for the anger of the tribals against the Dikus? Now, let's first see who were the Dikus. They were the outsiders such as moneylenders, traders, British officials, and missionaries who entered tribal areas under colonial rule. Now, what was the main cause of tribal anger? Economic exploitation. Like Dikus charge high interest loan, trapped tribals in debt, and often seized their land. Now, traditional system like Khunt Katti were replaced by private property laws, allowing outsiders to grab tribal lands. Now, British authorities and landlords demanded taxes, and tribals had never paid taxes before. Now, tribals were made to work as bonded or unpaid laborers, meaning Vithvigari. Now, missionaries and officials tried to alter tribal customs, faith, and social order, threatening their identity. So, what was the impact? The cumulative operation led to deep resentment and revolt, culminating in tribal uprising such as Ulgulan, led by Birsa Munda. Next is what was Birsa's vision of a golden age? Why do you think such a vision appealed to the people of the region? Now, Birsa Munda dreamed of bringing back a time when the tribal people were free, united, and happy before the British and outsider took away their land and traditions. He wanted a society based on honesty, purity, equality, and self rule, where the tribals could live with dignity and independence. Birsa's vision of a golden age was not just a spiritual idea, it was a socio political movement that blended religion, reform, and resistance. Now, it aimed at ending British rule and Diku's dominance. It advocated for self-governance known as Munda Raj, symbolizing tribal autonomy. It demanded restoration of land rights and abolition of forced labor and taxes. Now, if we see on the basis of social and moral aspect, it promoted moral reforms like no liquor, witchcraft, or superstition. It encouraged unity, honesty, and simplicity among the tribal. It urged people to return to their cultural roots and tradition. Birsa Munda declared himself as a messiah chosen by God to save the tribals. It gave the movement a religious and emotional appeal, helping people believe in a new beginning. So, why did this vision appeal to the people? The tribal communities were facing severe deprivation due to the land alienation, forest restriction, and economic exploitation. Birsa's vision offered hope for resolving these hardships. His call to return to a golden age of self governance and dignity resonated deeply with their desire to reclaim control over their land, culture, and lives. The spiritual and moral aspect of his vision provided a sense of renewal and identity restoration in the face of cultural threats from missionaries and colonial rule. Birsa's leadership united various tribal groups under a common cause, inspiring courage and collective resistance against injustice. In the next video, we will start with the new chapter, which is chapter 5, When People Rebel. It was about 1857 and after. Thank you.